Before we begin, I just want to say that if somebody doesn't want you to call them something, you shouldn't call them that. However, if that person then says that said thing they don't want to be called is a slur, that is a claim that needs to be substantiated with evidence. Second off, this is going to be my last video on Lily Orchard for a while. I'm not saying I won't come back to her ever again, but there aren't really any other videos of hers at the moment that I particularly want to cover. Although, hey, if there are any videos of hers that you do want me to cover, just say so in the comments, and I'll take a look at them. Lastly, I have a Tumblr blog now, link in the description. There you can ask me questions and basically just see me posting things that I would have probably posted on Twitter, but either I saw them on Twitter, or the character limit wouldn't let me. Now, let's get into the commentary.
At the conclusion of Steven Universe's Garbage and Here's Why, I made this remark about the LGBT spectrum. This is applicable toward, well, really anybody who falls under the LGBT spectrum. Is it a spectrum? I'm gonna say it is, because this doesn't fit in a spoken dialogue very well.
LGBTQIA+. First try. Better than Orchard at this already. Also, LGBT is a category. It's not a spectrum. What would it even look like as a spectrum? Could you plot it out on a line and then on one end have the most LGBT person in all of existence? In the case of things like gender or sexual orientation, you at the very least know what the two edges, the two endpoints of the spectrum are. Man and woman in the case of gender, and heterosexual and homosexual in the case of sexual orientation. Again, what are the two ends of an LGBT spectrum? This doesn't make any sense linguistically.
And this is a slur, and fuck that noise. This would, in any sane world, be the exact opposite of a controversial statement, but sadly we don't live in a sane world. We live in a shitty world, where this offensive slur is being pushed by a small number of people as an umbrella term for the entire LGBT community.
And you can tell it's bad because she put an incredibly squashed X over it.
This attitude is fucking gross, and here's why. The usage of the Q slur as an identifier is the subject of a lot of debate, usually centered around the term's origin and whether it's appropriate to use the term or not.
In Lily's case, it's only acceptable if covered by an incredibly squished red X. Seriously, why the fuck is that X so squished? It's not even an X at that point. It's just a greater than and less than sign put together. I understand this is like the definition of a nitpick, but it does actually really annoy me.
Unfortunately, the debate itself splits into two separate camps, only one of which I hold a strong and passionate objection to. The first camp are people who choose to use the Q slur as a self-identifier because I don't really know why. Everyone seems to have different reasons for using it, but the general gist of it is that the dozens of other terms are not good enough for one reason or another. The other camp are the advocates for the adoption of the Q slur as an umbrella term for the entire LGBT community, arguing that the large and diverse pool of terminology is too specific, and we need to make everything more broad and all-encompassing. We can talk about those fucking jackasses in a moment. The central argument to both of these people is that the Q slur wasn't originally a slur, and was originally a term used proudly by the LGBT community back during the era of the Stonewall riots.
I want to note real quick, Lily keeps talking about various LGBT movements and making direct reference to the 60s LGBT community, when the events and opinions she lists are actually much more 70s than 60s. She just mentioned the era of the Stonewall riots, for example, which, side note, makes about as much sense linguistically as saying the era of the Gulf of Tonkin when talking about the Vietnam War. It was an event, not an era. What are you talking about? But Stonewall happened in the last half of the last year of the 60s. It began on June 28th, 1969, and ended on July 3rd. By the way, this is why we celebrate Pride Month in June, in case you guys were curious. The gay rights movements, and I specifically say that and not LGBT rights for reasons I'll get to in a minute, of the 60s were actually primarily assimilationist in nature. And they didn't like terms like queer because, well, Lily explains later, it means strange, and they did not want homosexuality to be viewed as strange. The entire point of their movements were to make the idea of homosexuality normal to mainstream society. This also caused them to reject things like, we'll call them the more deviant aspects of certain parts of homosexual culture at the time. Oh, and transgender people. They really didn't like transgender people as well. This is all covered in Thaddeus Russell's amazing book, A Renegade History of the United States, if you all are curious and would like more information. You see, the reason why the Stonewall Riot is typically seen as the beginning of the modern LGBT movement isn't because nobody was arguing for rights of what we would currently call LGBT people before that point, but instead because it was the first time there was an unapologetic stand. Although there were protests before that point, leaders of said protests basically demanded it be nothing more than men in business suits talking about how homosexuality is normal and then leaving. You weren't even allowed to engage in any public displays of affection because, as we all know, heterosexual people never do that, and we have to make ourselves look normal. Okay, I make fun of that, but to be fair, this was before you were allowed to even show a pregnant woman on television or imply that your married characters slept in the same beds, so that might have actually been the case back then. Of course, this led to a divide with a lot of people, mostly younger LGBT people, thinking that's incredibly stupid, and they got their own little subculture and their own bars and hangouts at some point down the line, one of those hangouts being the Stonewall Inn, which was incredibly lower class and vulgar. And as a result, a lot of the higher-ups in the movement at the time hated it. It was a shift from assimilation and normalization to liberation that primarily occurred after Stonewall. And the fact that the 70s was filled with liberation movements and left-wing movements in general, it certainly really helped matters. And the particularly astute of you might have noticed that the 70s aren't the 60s. It appears Lily, however, didn't notice that.
Before it was co-opted into a slur by straight people to take power from the LGBT community. Except that's not its actual origin. The Q slur originates from a 16th century German word meaning oblique or perverse, and it finds its roots in the English language as a term to mean strange and odd. It also has a third-person usage, which means something that has been ruined. You may actually remember the word's proper usage from The Nightmare Before Christmas, of all things.
What's this? In here, they've got a little tree. How queer! And who would ever think?
Can't believe Jack Skellington used a slur against Christmas.
The usage of it to refer to an LGBT person is an informal use, like when people use literally as a form of hyperbole. The word is not a kind word. Objectively, it has never been, and it never will be.
The word is so mean, in fact, that it recently punched me in the face multiple times for no reason. That's how mean of a word it is.
And the belief that the term originates as an LGBT term is not only wrong, it's a dangerous precedent to set for modern young people who haven't read up on the actual history of language. The Q slur has more in common with the neo-Nazi pejorative degenerate than it does anything else.
But degenerate has a much more negative implication, primarily because it not only calls something strange, but inherently implies that the person engaging in that thing is lesser. Degenerate means to lose something or to revert in some way. Even using the definition you put on screen earlier in the video, queer just means strange. Something can be strange, but not inherently be lesser than the normal. People with green eyes make up 2% of the population. It is objectively a strange eye color to have. By saying that, am I saying that people with green eyes are lesser than people without green eyes? I hope not, considering I have green eyes. Objectively, it is incredibly odd to be left-handed, considering only 10% of the population is. By saying that, am I therefore saying that left-handed people are lesser than people who are right-handed or ambidextrous? Was Weird Al calling himself degenerate this entire time and nobody noticed until now?
But isn't its history as an LGBT term important to consider? No, Billy, it really isn't. Why not? For the same reason that the crows in Dumbo are looked down on today. Even if we accepted the premise that the Q slur was originally a point of LGBT pride with no other history behind,
why is Billy sticking his tongue out?
That wouldn't be the win card so many people think it is, because guess what else was a point of pride for LGBT people?
The handkerchief code. Especially if you are at this point in the spectrum or farther.
Because guess what else was a point of pride for LGBT people? Pornography! Because guess what else was a point of pride for LGBT people?
I'm just a sweet transvestite from transsexual Transylvania.
Rocky Horror Picture Show was a fucking galling film released in 1975 that took every trans-misogynistic trope possible, rolled them into a single character that then rapes two people and grooms another to be a sex slave.
Okay, Frankenfurter did rape Brad and Janet, that is true, because he's the villain of the movie, and as such does bad things. But who the hell did he groom exactly? The only person I can think of who matches the description Oh my god, Lily did not make the mistake I think she made, did she? Lily, he was a sex robot. The movie was literally named after him. I thought you'd at least pay enough attention to know the basics of that character. Have you even seen this movie? I should also note that if Frankenfurter is a combination of various trans-misogynistic tropes, many of which, by the way, weren't established for decades until after Rocky Horror was released, it seems like a very important one was forgotten, and that's Frankenfurter isn't trans. You know that, right? Wikipedia calls him a cross-dressing pansexual mad scientist. The same article later calls him an eccentric transvestite scientist, and although transvestite and transgender share the same first four letters, in practice they have about as much in common as television and telephone. You see, at the time Rocky Horror was released, transvestite was a term that was primarily used in reference to cross-dressers or drag queens, although it had been used derogatorily to refer to everyone from effeminate men to, well, transgender people. But either way, that was an informal, insulting use. The definition has always been specifically in reference to cross-dressers, not transgender people. Transgender people, I should point out, by definition, are not cross-dressing when wearing female clothes because they are women. His page on the Rocky Horror Wiki also refers to him as a male.
And somehow, beyond all reason, this has become a huge piece of LGBT culture, applauded and almost never spoken out against.
I just want to point out the article she shows is about promoting a video where a guy says he came out as gay because of this movie. What the fuck, Lily?
Very rarely does someone speak out against it, at which point a lot of other LGBT people will dogpile on those people for daring to question a shitty portion of LGBT culture as if we're somehow exempt from the same levels of basic human decency that other people are.
Okay, I actually looked up this post, and after scrolling through the first 8 or so pages of notes, I'll admit I didn't scroll through all 8,400 of them, but after scrolling through the first 8 or so pages of these notes, I was able to find one person politely disagreeing with the characterization of Frankenfurter as transgender because he's not. Wait a minute, this post also makes the same mistake Lily did, saying that Frankenfurter groomed Rocky Horror and not that he's a robot. Wait, what was Lily's description of the movie again?
Rocky Horror Picture Show was a fucking galling film released in 1975 that took every trans-misogynistic trope possible, rolled them into a single character that then rapes two people and grooms another to be a sex slave, and somehow, beyond all reason, this has become a huge piece of LGBT culture, applauded and almost never spoken out against.
You've never seen the Rocky Horror Picture Show, have you? You're basing your entire opinion on it off of Tumblr posts, aren't you? Tumblr posts that get details about the movie wrong, I should note, but that you then put in the video word for word, well, almost word for word, without double checking. I also want to point out that this Tumblr post is kind of stupid. Mainstream society didn't make Rocky Horror popular. It bombed when it was first released, and even to this day is really only a cult hit, albeit it has one of the largest cult fan bases of any film. And said cult fan base, I should note, is primarily made up of people who felt represented by the movie and its themes of weirdness, openness, and, well, fun. Also, the tropes Frankenfurter embodies, which I should note were originally designed to denigrate gay people, not trans people, already existed long before Rocky Horror, but what made Rocky Horror so entertaining to so many people was that it flipped these tropes on its head by actually turning the character with them into something fun. Someone who the audience wanted to be like. You know, this was covered in a video that I remember reading a Huffington Post article about a while ago. And look, I just want to be very clear when I say this. If Lily doesn't like the Rocky Horror Picture Show, or if that one Tumblr blogger doesn't like it, that's fine. They're adults. They have the right to their opinions. This is America. Well, okay, I guess Lily lives in Canada, but you guys get my point. However, nobody has the right to spread misinformation, and that's exactly what these two are doing.
Problems like this are all over the LGBT community, with properties and people who would be considered brazenly offensive and gross in any other demographic held up and applauded as icons.
You do know there's an actual name for this occurring, right? It's Mexicans Love Speedy Gonzalez. A TV tropes trope which is defined by a group of people embracing a character or piece of media many think would be offensive to them. And what do you know, the Rocky Horror Picture Show is actually mentioned on that page, with TV tropes writing, "The Rocky Horror Picture Show has a sizable LGBT fan base, despite some of the choices in depicting such communities not holding up too well today. For the time, it was widely progressive and opened up a lot of eyes, so modern backlash is more of a result of increased sensitivity towards LGBT groups, some of which might be owed to Rocky Horror itself putting them out there." Oh, also, remember this part?
But isn't its history as an LGBT term important to consider? No, Billy, it really isn't. Why not? For the same reason that the crows in Dumbo are looked down on today.
The crows from Dumbo are divisive for being stereotypical caricatures of African Americans, but they did have some black fans. They are based on real black entertainers of the time, and most of them are voiced by actual African American singers. These details are often lost on modern audiences. Floyd Norman, one of Disney's first black animators, defended them due to their basis in reality, and Whoopi Goldberg once expressed a desire to see them in more Disney merchandise. It helps that they're likable and supportive characters.
Rocky Horror Picture Show is just the most notable example on a very long list of extremely problematic faves. The existence of TERFs and True Scum also indicate that LGBT people are more than capable of being garbage humans, especially to each other, so the completely myopic view of these things is almost expected. Rocky Horror is considered a big part of gay culture, and so the fact that it's almost a minstrel show depiction of trans people isn't important to a lot of its fans because, not my problem.
Okay, even giving you the benefit of the doubt and assuming this is true, that actually doesn't mean anything. If you are correct, its popularity would just be an example of insult backfire. It wouldn't inherently say anything about those who like the work. And by the way, the LGBT community has quite possibly the most extensive history of insult backfires out of any marginalized group. Back in the 70s, lesbians very famously wore shirts that said "Lavender Menace" in response to the National Organization of Women of all groups, referring to them as that, while saying that they hurt feminism or something. It didn't make any sense. The Black Triangle, which the Nazis put on people in concentration camps who were there for being asocial, which included lesbians, has also been used by lesbian groups in the past. Hence why both of these details actually made it into the first lesbian pride flag. Now, the symbol the Nazis used for homosexual men was the pink triangle, and this symbol also has a very long history in the LGBT and gay rights movements. The AIDS charity ACT UP used the symbol in their Silence Equals Death campaign, for example, and by the 1990s, the symbol was so reclaimed that a pink triangle with a green circle around it was seen to represent an organization or place being a safe space for LGBT people. Oh, also, Frankenfurter wore a pink triangle in Rocky Horror, fun fact. Of course, all of this is assuming that O'Brien is actually transphobic, which, spoiler alert, I do not believe. The article Lily put on screen here is a 2016 one from Gay Star News, where O'Brien essentially says that he does not view transgender women as the same as cisgender women, albeit in much more harsh and blunt language. Now, in 2020, O'Brien clarified that he was talking about natural women, which I assume he just means cis women. So the statement is essentially, trans women can never become cis women, which, no shit. But that did not happen until a few years after Orchard's video, so I will not hold her accountable for not knowing that. I will hold her accountable for jumping to the conclusion of transphobia, considering O'Brien has been openly gender fluid for years now.
So while people might like to make the claim that LGBT people in the 60s used to call themselves the Q slur, this isn't exactly winning the argument, because all you're telling me is that the gay community of the 60s was extremely problematic. Hey guys, guess what? One of the N-words appears in Martin Luther King's letter to Birmingham jail. That doesn't mean you should start running out and calling people that. If this letter was written today, the word would not fucking be there, because we've long since realized that it never should have been used in the first fucking place, because that's how the evolution of cultural enlightenment actually works.
You heard it here first. Had Martin Luther King Jr. been arrested for non-violently protesting segregation today, and then saw an article in a newspaper criticizing him for being divisive, and decided to write a response to it while in jail, he would not have said the word Negro in said response. What the hell are you talking about? There's something in politics called the Tocqueville effect, which essentially states that the less injustice there is, the more small injustices become viewable. To put it another way, the reason why black people are offended by being called Negroes is because they have civil rights. So the statement that King wouldn't say this today doesn't make any sense, because if he were in the conditions where he would write this today, this word would not be offensive.
It was always unacceptable, and the fact that our parents did it anyway is a bad mark on them.
Acceptable is an entirely relative term, though. If something was commonplace and seen as perfectly fine, it was not always unacceptable by definition. She goes on to talk about the use of the N-word by black people and basically says it's still a profanity, and I don't have anything to say about that part, so I'm cutting it out. I will say I find this entire comparison to be incredibly stupid. Even though gay and transgender people have had it very hard throughout American history, it is nothing compared to what black people have had to go through. For one, it was never legal to own gay and transgender people as property, just off the very top of my head. But Lily says she's responding to other people using this comparison, so I'll cut her some slack and not hold that fact against her necessarily.
It is an antagonistic word and is treated as such. The Q slur is unfortunately not afforded the same level of restraint. People treat reclamation as if it's some kind of magical society changer, as if they're the Supreme Court of language. When people fill my ear about the fact that the Q slur is being reclaimed as a term by the LGBT community, all I can really wonder is when this actually happened, because it seems to be an extremely contentious topic because the word has a harmful and deadly legacy. People love to talk about the LGBT community of the 60s, but what about the people who were beaten and killed by others while having it screamed at them?
I don't know, Lily. What about the kids who grew up in the 2000s that remember the word gay being used to mean stupid or lame?
What about the people who've experienced the harsh truth of being called that slur and are quite frankly disgusted that some idiot kids would have the nerve to just declare that everything's okay now?
Each generation imagines itself to be more intelligent than the one that went before it and wiser than the one that comes after it. George Orwell.
It's time to come back to what I was talking about earlier. It's not just that people are using it to refer to themselves. That would be a non-issue, but instead there's a big push to use the Q slur as an umbrella term for the LGBT community, regardless of that community's actual feelings on the matter. And speaking as someone in the LGBT community, no. Fuck no. Are you fucking kidding me? No! Putting aside the fact that this is, as I've established, a derogatory term meant to describe something as a strange other and has a violent and hateful legacy attached to it, the LGBT community already has an umbrella term. LGBTQIA+. This term, while indeed murder on the vocal cord, serves the job of an umbrella term much better by clearly conveying everything it's meant to convey. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning.
Lily, that's not the questioning flag. That's the queer flag. The LGBTQIA+ wiki also says it can be used to mean both questioning and queer, for the record.
Intersex, asexual / aromantic, and everything else. The everything else that this this point being pansexual and non-binary people.
Non-binary is already included under trans, though, with trans just meaning not cis.
LGBTQIA+, or the acronym as it's come to be known, isn't perfect. Not only is it awkward to say, leading many to shorten it to just LGBT, it's a mess of redundancies and strange decisions, like questioning getting its own letter while pansexual and non-binary people are shunted into the plus. Those should be flipped around, or perhaps just take out the stupid plus and add the P in the end. But it does something that no other umbrella term has ever bothered to do. It's inclusive. It's a mess, but like any acronym, it can be adjusted.
Oh, I know of some people who really want to adjust it, including in ways that I know for a fact Lily would not agree with. So, if anything, isn't it being adjustable a bit of a downside because it means that new letters can be added or removed based on the whims of whoever it is that are using it?
Queer, on the other hand, is an obfuscating term.
I see somebody else knows how to use the blur effects.
It strips out the nuance of non-straight identities and waters them down into an amorphous gray sludge. And when you're trying to apply that to everybody, well, imagine taking the vast array of pride flags and replacing them all with a single brown square. That's what queer does to people's identities. And that's not helpful because everyone experiences oppression differently. Bisexual people can get shit from gay people and called deceitful. Trans people get shit from both of them and called mentally ill. Asexual people get shit from literally fucking everybody for no good reason whatsoever. Non-binary people are still being expected to prove they exist, with both TERFs and True Scum constantly giving them shit, again for no good reason whatsoever.
But under that kind of scrutination, all umbrella terms fall apart. Non-binary people can get shit from binary trans people. People with xenogenders can get shit from non-binary people who just use they, them. Does that mean non-binary is not a good umbrella term? Hell, black people can hate Asian people can hate Latinos, and so on and so forth. Does that mean that people of color is not a good umbrella term? Again, you can pick at every term like this. What is your point?
And now we're grinding just a little more shit into everyone's eyes by expecting them to adopt a new identity that is explicitly designed to obfuscate things and reduce people's identities down to a vague, meaningless non-word. Nobody is ever helped by being covered with a sheet, and I say no. I thoroughly reject the notion that this term should be adopted as an umbrella term for an extremely diverse set of people with vastly different experiences, needs, and concerns. We have enough problems to deal with when the government tries to erase our identities. We don't need to be erasing each other's identities as well. Apply it to yourself if you feel so inclined.
She says after an entire video where she talks about how it's a slur that's gotten LGBT people killed. Anyway, that's all I wanted to cover, so final thoughts. If you want to say a word has a long and harmful history behind it, I at least expect you to know something about said history. Good night, and good luck.